Okay, welcome to the Lava Fantasy Football League. This is the Week 8 recap. Probably in much better spirits this week. Good for me, not so good for some of the other guys. As always, where there's a winner, there's a loser, and vice versa. Today's drink is, I finally made a cocktail. It's been a minute since I made one. This is called a Remember the Maine. It's kind of interesting. Has rye whiskey, vermouth, sweet vermouth, cherry herring liqueur, absinthe rinse, and then you express some lemon oils on it, and there's a cherry on top. So first time for me tasting it. Kind of similar to a Vu Carré. Similar components, but we'll try it. That's good. It's a nice riff on a classic cocktail. Actually, this is an old cocktail, but it's really good. That's good. Yeah, so this week, very interesting week of football. Some serious upsets, some injuries as usual, and then the trade deadline. So we just had the trade deadline earlier today. There have been not a whole lot of trades this year, but there are some that have made some significant impact. Let's just get into it. So the first matchup is me versus Brad. This looked like it was going to be a close one. As you can see, the original projections had us like a point apart. And then early on, I think Brad had a really strong outlook because of what Joe Burrow was able to do. So Joe Burrow looks like he's back, and it was at expense of his own San Francisco team. So he looked like vintage Joe Burrow. And when we talk about vintage Joe Burrow, we're talking about the year when they went to the Super Bowl. So interesting how things can change from the beginning of the series, where like Joe Burrow looked bad and awful. And we were talking about how, is this the same thing that's happening to Brad with what happened when he had Russell Wilson? I think it's a question to ask, but I don't think anybody really believed it, because I think there's a lot more conviction that Burrow was good, actually a great quarterback, and it's just a matter of his health was an issue, and then he seems healthy now. I think the bigger surprise is how much they carved San Francisco up. San Francisco is on like a 3-game losing streak, so that was incredibly. Ugh. Anyways, for the rest of his scores, Garrett Wilson had a really good game. 100 receiving yards off of 7 catches and 6 rushing yards. Addison is just one of those rookies who looks solid going forward. Jordan Addison had 82 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdowns. It's just a tough break is his quarterback got injured, torn Achilles for Kirk Cousins. So we'll get into what the future for Addison is going forward, but we'll come back to that later. Bijan Robinson had a pretty solid game. I think head-to-head between him, it's going to be like he's always going to be compared to Jahmyr Gibbs. And then so if you look across the board, you can see that Jahmyr Gibbs had a huge game for me. He finally had that breakout game. So their careers are going to be compared, because these are the 2 first-round running backs in a year when not a lot of running backs were given much love, right? So it was kind of a big question mark. Why are you drafting running backs in the first round? They've had a measure of success for each of them. I guess right now Gibbs is a little bit on the higher end. Rest of his scores, Cook had an okay rushing game. Mark Andrews had a strong game. Nico Collins on the down, and then pretty good kicking game for him. And then the defense, again, getting carved up by Joe Burrow and the Cincinnati. And then for me, it was a late push to get this win, and then in the end I just ran away with the score. So if you're taking a look at what happened, I'm obviously carrying a lot of Detroit guys. They had a Monday Night Football game against the Raiders, and a lot of them showed out, and it was enough to at least get me that win. If you look across the board, it seems like Goff didn't have a great game, which is kind of weird because his Amon-Ra St. Brown had a good game. He had over 100 receiving yards. Calvin Ridley had an okay game. It's a good bounce back after his bad game last week. And then, like we said, Gibbs finally broke out, and my conviction was rewarded. You know, like I knew that Detroit wanted to draft him to be like their version of Alvin Kamara or Christian McCaffrey. He's finally put together a game to demonstrate that, yes, he has it in him to do it. The question now is, can he do it on a week-to-week basis for the entire season and for multiple seasons? Because that will be the true test if he can actually reach that level. Breece Hall had a really strong game. It was actually pretty mediocre outside of this one big catch where he ran for a touchdown, and that's where I got all the points from. Laporta had a really strong game as well, having a nice touchdown. Interestingly, he wasn't my highest scoring tight end. Jameson Williams was more underwhelming. He had one nice catch and then one where he got blown up in the backfield by Max Crosby. That guy's insane anyway. Matt Prater had an okay game, and then the Detroit D really showed out against against the Las Vegas Raiders. Off of the bench, the most interesting things for us, Brock Purdy had a good fantasy game, but in real life, there's a lot of question marks with him surrounding him because they've lost 3 in a row, and that's kind of crazy for a team who everyone is picking as a Super Bowl contender. Jerry Jeudy had a nice touchdown catch, even though he didn't have a lot of production otherwise, but that was good and fantasy relevant. For me, not a whole lot. Maybe playing Pickens ahead of Jameson Williams, but again, he, just like Jerry Jeudy, he had one catch for a touchdown. That was it. That was his entire score. I don't know. It's just not working out. I think Deontay Johnson, whoever has Deontay Johnson, is beneficiary of that. And then for me, I picked up Trey McBride as the guy to like play in the place of Sam Laporta when Sam Laporta goes out, and he balled. They had a late push against the Ravens, nearly coming back actually, giving the Ravens all they can. Again, crazy league. Baltimore just destroyed the Lions last week. Come to this week and they struggle with a team like the Cardinals with a journeyman quarterback in Josh Dobbs, who's actually no longer with the team. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I get the win, a much needed win. That gets me to 3-5. Brad falls to 2-6. I need the win more because like I have a big, huge bye week coming up, and that's probably a scheduled loss for me. So it's good to get the win for my team in both fantasy and in real life. Next up, Darren versus Eric. The projections were more of a blowout in Darren's case, but the score actually turned out to be a lot closer than expected. And surprisingly, Darren was able to pull off this win because he had pretty mediocre performances from several positions. It just so happened that he had strong performances from unusual, not necessarily unusual places, but not from the typical spots. So Mahomes, you expect way more, but apparently he was sick, and it showed, only having 241 passing yards, and he actually threw a couple of picks. Christian Kirk down to only 4 catches. Godwin had a decent game with 5 catches, 54 yards, and a touchdown, and he was really buoyed by McCaffrey, like a classic McCaffrey game, who was able to perform well despite Brock Purdy not being so good. And then Taylor having an okay game, but game-wise, pretty good because he had that bell cow thing, right? 12 rushes, 95 rushing yards. So they're putting him to use. He just needs to get into the end zone, I think. And then Lockett had a strong game, and the Dallas D really, really stomping on the Rams helped him to get this win. For Eric, it got closer than expected because big, huge play from Dak Prescott. So this is probably the best game of Prescott's season. Zay Flowers was underwhelming. Rice was okay. That's kind of like, again, tied to Mahomes not being so well. Najee Harris also continues to be underwhelming. Now it's not even the case of him versus TJ Warren because I think both of them aren't looking that hot. Derrick Henry, looking fresh in those Oilers uniforms, balled out, had 101 rushing yards and 21 receiving yards. And then Taysom Hill had a big score for him. 2 rushing touchdowns, helping them get the win against the Colts. McLaurin had a good game too, a receiving touchdown, 63 receiving yards on 5 catches, and a decent game from his kicker, and then not that great of a defensive game from Buffalo. Off of the bench for both of them, Higgins was okay, and then not much else. Like I said, he had Warren too, right? So you're comparing Warren and Harris. They both have been underwhelming. I don't know, but maybe they can turn it around. But I mean, at this point of the season, it's hard to say. Like, what else can they do to improve the situation? I think a lot of the blame right now is going to the offensive coordinator, Matt Canada. For Darren, he had a really good game off the bench for Shaheed. 153 receiving yards and a touchdown. That's a big score from him. And then he was able to pick up this rookie receiver, Josh Downs. So here's another rookie receiver who is now on everyone's radar, and he was a good prospect. It's just what you're starting to see with rookies is some of them take a little bit while to get settled to the league, and once they're good and settled, then they're gonna make some noise. And in this case, you got a guy like Josh Downs doing it. I mentioned previously Jahmyr Gibbs being able to show out. We talked a little too last week about tight end Dalton Kincaid finally showing up. That's just how it is, they are stocks that are starting to appreciate and having a lot more value now. And so that's how some of the teams are going to get stronger as the season goes on, because you're going to have guys that get better as the season progresses. The next matchup, this was a fun one. Richie and Gary. Ooh, this was a tight one and a close one. Went down to the wire. Tough break for Gary, who kind of experienced what I experienced last week by having his team lose both in fantasy and in real life. But he nearly had the comeback win, and it all came down to his kicker. But for Richie, he was able to build up enough of a big lead. Again, Jackson kind of came back down, regressed from his breakout game last week. Diggs is kind of underwhelming for what we expected of him. CeeDee Lamb balled out, and he had his best game of the season. 158 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns and 12 catches. Big time game from CeeDee Lamb. I think he is the highest fantasy performer of the week, period. Mixon, he's a guy that people write off, but he continues to ball out. Again, tied to the fact that Joe Burrow is back and healthy, and now you have stock up for the rest of the Cincinnati weapons. Tyjae Spears kind of a little bit underwhelming, but was going to be kind of interesting, right? Because if they were going to trade away Derrick Henry, that would have been Tyjae Spears' job, but it never happened. So he's still going to just be a handcuff at this point. We talk about Kincaid. Now he's showing up. That first round capital is starting to be realized, and I think a big part of that is because Knox is no longer playing, so Kincaid is stepping in, and for whatever reason, Josh Allen realizes, I have a talented receiver I can throw to, and then now starting to build that chemistry with him, right? That's the other thing. Chemistry needs to be built between receivers and quarterbacks more than any other position, in my opinion, especially when it comes to fantasy. Right? A running back, you can hand the ball off to them. Maybe they have some chemistry with the line, but a lot of it depends on talent level of each individuals. But in this case, if there's no connection with a receiver and a quarterback, it may not be good. Fairbairn only gave him 1 extra point. Cleveland D, who was strong, did not show up this week. They lost to Seattle. And then for Gary, Stafford, I think he hurt his hand, only had 162 passing yards. Again, they got bushwhacked by Dallas. Puka Nacua kind of came back, so you can see the stacking. Jalen Waddle showed up and might be his best game of the season. 121 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown off of 7 catches. Amazing, because they can have great games still from Tyreek Hill, and then Waddle still comes out and can ball out. That offense is just tailor-made for fantasy. It's a fantasy gold mine. Madison, kind of underwhelming, even though they pulled out that win. Kareem Hunt showed up and had a really good game for Gary. Kelsey had an okay game, and tying to that game, we didn't talk about the loss, but again, we said how Mahomes was sick and whatever. Maybe those can be excuses, but pay attention to who they lost to. They lost to the Denver Broncos, who have been horrible most of the season. And yet they pull out this win. So this is why you can never underestimate teams within a division. They'll always get up and play, even though the stats will say otherwise, like that Kansas City has won. I don't know. Their winning streak against Denver has been insanely long. This is the first time that Mahomes has lost to Denver and whatnot. But they pulled it off, This is just another example of any given Sunday. This is the biggest upset of the week by far. Josh Jacobs had a good game, and it all tied to that one little drive where in the middle of the second quarter, where all of a sudden the Raiders just couldn't be stopped on the ground, and Jacobs ran them all the way down the field, getting the touchdown. Unfortunately, that was the only thing for them. Could have had a little bit more points, but it wasn't enough. The Los Angeles Charger D got him the standard 10 points that you get the default with. And then we want to talk about Patterson, because Patterson is the key to this margin of victory for Richie. Patterson had 20 points for the Lions. He started off big, 3 field goals in the first half. One of them was like a 51-yarder. It was crazy. And then he was able to get him right up to this 3-point margin. And they had 2 more chances to be able to take the lead. They set up for the field goal. This is kind of a chip shot, but it's at least 3 points. So I think that 3 points at least gets you at tying level. Maybe it's a little bit longer. He misses it. He misses the easiest field goal of the night, and that really hurt Gary. And then they had the chance again to kick a field goal. I think it was 4th and 2nd with 2.5 or 3 minutes left. Lions decided to go for it so that they could ice the game instead. They get the first down, and then they need the clock all the way. No chance for any more points from Patterson. A valiant effort. Great chance for Gary to win, but Richie just escapes by the skin of his teeth. As far as their bench goes, not a lot to talk about on Richie's bench, but for Gary, he had a solid game from Javonte Williams, 85 rushing yards, 1 receiving touchdown. That really helped them pull off the upset against Kansas City. I think playing him at running back instead of Madison gets you the win too. It's just one of those tough breaks. One of those shoulda, coulda, was, but it didn't happen. Speaking of the Raiders though, it's a bad way, but I think they have good pieces. Surprisingly, they didn't make any trades at the deadline. There was a big talk about trading Devontae Adams. Never happened. As much as people are like, he deserves to go somewhere else, it never happened. I think maybe they should keep him, but it's probably time to move on from that coaching staff, because it seems like that coaching staff does not put these players in a position to win. From what I saw on the Monday night game, they play great on defense. That offense though, they have weapons. They have Josh Jacobs who can pound the ball. They have weapons at receiver with Devontae Adams. I know there's a big question mark about Garoppolo not being able to get him the ball, but when Garoppolo plays for a good team, they can at least be a winning team, you know? So maybe they do need a change at quarterback. To me, they need more of a change with the coaching staff. I don't know. They already had a proof of concept with this head coach who just did not succeed, and they tried to do it anyway. Still hasn't succeeded. Okay, next up. Brownsville Jets versus James Swag team. Mike is, I don't know. I know we talked about how great Jeremy looks. Mike is looking like a juggernaut right now. He had a total of 141.46 points. I think that's the highest score for the week. Most of that is buoyed by Jalen Hurts as usual. 4 passing touchdowns, and it was the kind of game where they needed it. You know, like Washington was on the verge of an upset, forcing Philly to forcing them into a shootout with them, essentially making it great for fantasy owners. Even Devontae Smith was able to get a receiving touchdown and almost 100 yards. DJ Moore had an okay game. I think Bajan had a come down game, and that kind of tied to DJ Moore. Saquon Barkley had a solid game. As long as he's healthy, it makes them strong and competitive. There's a lot of question marks with that team too, but they're definitely a different team with Barkley, and as long as he's there, he's going to produce and help them. At least they had a chance to win this game for sure. They just slipped and lost to the Jets as well. Deontay Foreman, not a great game, but strong game from TJ Hawkinson, and amazing game from Gus Edwards. Edwards had 3 rushing touchdowns, 80 rushing yards off of 19 attempts. That was enough to get him 141.6 points. For James, he had a respectable score at least. Herbert finally has a really good game. 3 passing touchdowns. Rashad White, a decent score. And then A.J. Brown balled out, man. I know we talk about how great Tyreek Hill is. What A.J. Brown is doing, use the eye test, right? What Tyreek Hill is doing is amazing because he's a speedster who can run away from people, and he has the benefit of this offense that takes advantage of it. What A.J. Brown is doing, with getting blanketed, and it's not the same offense. What he's doing is amazing. He has these crazy catches, and he's just been dominant. So I don't know. It's just wild to me how we can say Tyreek Hill is gonna have a 2,000 yard rushing season, and there's an argument to be said that AJ Brown is still the best receiver in the league this year. That's how amazing he is. Just using the eyeball test, not looking at any stats or anything like that. That's how great he has looked when you watch the games. McManus had a huge game too, 176 field goal yards. That's a bunch of field goals. 2 field goals from 30 to 39 yards and 2 field goals that are 50 plus. So that gets them into almost 20-point range. The defenses on both sides kind of underwhelming. Off the bench, let's see. Looks like they're turning to Henderson for the Rams. Again, they got destroyed by Dallas, so it's kind of hard. Tunga Viola had a strong game, and then pretty much virtually the same score as Herbert, so no change there. Deebo Samuel is a guy that'll strengthen you when he comes back healthy, and then that's a big reason why San Francisco is probably losing, and then pretty average scores from the rest of the guys. Morgan versus Big Mike. Mike had the lowest score of the week. Morgan had a pretty strong game. Let's see. Interesting. You chose to start Jordan Love. I mean, I guess your alternative was Desmond Ridder, who had a really bad passing game. Jordan Love had 229 passing yards. They lost again. Jamar Chase had a strong game, tied to Joe Burrow being solid. 100 receiving yards and a touchdown. Thielen has been great, helping Houston actually get their first win of the season. And he has had that chemistry. It was evident, to me, just watching them in preseason, that Thielen and him and Bryce Young were going to have that connection. Surprised they didn't try to use the stock that he had to probably get some draft capital, trade him, because he's an older receiver, right? You could have trade him to a contender for draft picks. They did, trade away some draft picks to get Bryce Young, and I don't know, they're still rebuilding, and they could have used it. They didn't trade him. Etienne, solid running back, one of the better ones in the league this year. Alvin Kamara had a Alvin Kamara type game, a rushing touchdown, a receiving touchdown, 59 rushing yards. And then for Mike L, just the big story this week today is Devontae Adams only having one receiving yard for 11 yards. One reception for 11 receiving yards. He had two opportunities, had the ball been thrown correctly, to have like a 50-yard gain and maybe like a 80-yard gain, both for touchdowns, but it just never had the connections, and his frustration boiled over, his slamming his helmet on the ground. You tied it to David Carr. That was one of the reasons why there's that frustration, because they traded David Carr away. That was the guy he wanted to play with. So I don't know. It's right now it's a shaky marriage that, I don't know, it doesn't look good for the future. So if I'm Davis, the owner, I'm doing everything to placate Adams, because if you didn't trade him, he has to take precedent over that coaching staff. So you got to change things around for sure. Maybe you need a new quarterback. It's just not working out there. And then Kelly only having 2.7, Goddard having, that's kind of an average game for a tight end. And then just a bunch of single-digit scores, just not enough. You would lose to anybody, no matter who you played this week, unfortunately. Off the bench, not much to write about. Zach Moss had a solid game, but obviously not catching Morgan there. Last game, mediocre minions versus Fields for Sale. So this is Jeremy versus Aaron. Josh Allen balled out, even though they continue to like eke out these wins. These games have been close for them. A lot of people are talking about how their window to win a championship is fast closing. They did make a trade though for a good defensive player. We'll see. They have some tough matchups coming up. Tyreek Hill having 112 receiving yards and a touchdown. Keenan Allen having an okay game. I guess they didn't need him too much. It was enough to beat Chicago. Raheem Mostert, think this isn't that great of a game. It's just really buoyed by that rushing touchdown. Otherwise, that's a single-digit score there. DeAndre Swift kind of salvaged his score as well with a late touchdown. You know, they had that brotherly shove play, and they faked it to him, and he ran into the end zone. I don't know. He's coming back down to earth in terms of his rushing stats, you know. That honeymoon of him busting out early has, you know, I mean, this is the experience that I had with him as a Lion. The injuries are going to catch up at some point. Oh, I mean, I hope he continues to perform well. I'm a huge fan of him anyway. It was just always injuries was the problem. Evan Ingram had a really good game as well. Even though he lost a fumble, he had 10 catches for 88 receiving yards. Isaiah Pacheco and Sanders in your Miami D, nothing much. And then for Aaron, he had to play CJ Stroud because Justin Fields is still hurt. And in that head-to-head with him and Bryce Young actually got the better of him. And he's kind of, after like busting out early in the season, he's kind of regressing, which is almost like you kind of expect that. Like, it happens in two ways, right? Earlier, we talked about how some rookies take a while to hit the ground running, and when they get running, they get better and good. In the case of CJ Stroud and some of the others, they hit the ground running right away. And it's almost like they catch the league by surprise. But then after a while, the league will catch up to them and then kind of like expose some of their weaknesses that maybe were kind of hidden by ways that they took advantage early. And so he's kind of regressing a little bit. Still a good quarterback. He's definitely a pro quarterback, but it's kind of been changed right now. The defense is kind of taking over. They have the identity of their head coach, and it's more of a defensive strong team. Just unfortunately for me, what a defensive strong team needs is a good running game, and they do not have that. And a young quarterback needs a good running game too. They need that to turn around in a hurry. Chris Olave had 46 receiving yards, 5 receptions. Mike Evans had a touchdown, 39 receiving yards. Eckler had a strong game, 94 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown. He's essentially a receiver out of the backfield. Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard. Look at these fantasy scores. Look at this. 22, 18, 15, then 8.6, 8.5, 15.7, 7.2. What does that tell me about Tony Pollard? What we were expecting, I think this was what everyone was expecting, is with Ezekiel Elliott gone, Tony Pollard was going to become a bell cow. And he was going to be the beneficiary of that, and he would be one of the top running backs in the league. That has not played out. So what does that mean? I think it just means that Tony Pollard, that's not a role that he can play. I mean, he can play it, but it's not going to be at this exceptional level that people were probably hoping for. In the case, It looks like what Tony Pollard needs is he needs to be part of a committee. He needs another Ezekiel Elliott to come in. And so I know they were talking about trying to trade for Derrick Henry. And that probably would have been amazing for Pollard, to have that thunder and lightning component, but it just never happened. So we'll see. Maybe he has a chance to turn it around. Dallas was able to get this great win in spite of that, and then that was kind of buoyed by CeeDee Lamb going off. But the rushing game, honestly, has just been underwhelming for Dallas. George Kittle balled out. He had 149 receiving yards, 9 receptions. Valiant effort in the loss. Michael Pittman Jr. had a strong game. 1 receiving touchdowns, 8 catches for 40 receiving yards. Justin Tucker had a decent game, and then the Kansas City D was actually pretty okay in spite of the fact that they were able to lose as badly as they did. See, off the bench, oh, this is what we got to talk about. Jeremy, you have off the bench. DeAndre Hopkins had 3 touchdowns, 128 receiving yards, and 4 receptions. And then he's not even really the story here. The story is the new quarterback that he was throwing. We were talking about this, right? Guys that just weren't on the radar early on, all of a sudden they show up and here they are. We're talking about Will Levis. Will Levis, we're aware of Will Levis. He was a guy who, early on, I don't know if this is just the media pushing the narrative, but for the first overall pick, it was between those. They had 4 guys that were talked about in that top 5 range: Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, what's his name? The one that got injured for Indy, the one from Florida. I drafted him, and then Will Levis. Will Levis was on the guy. He has a monster arm, great athlete. Problem was the production. He was not winning at the college level, but he had all the physical tools and the attributes to be an amazing quarterback. It just so happens here, in the first game that he finally starts because Tannehill can't play, he balls out. He looks amazing. And then he's obviously going to be one who's going to be popular on the waiver wire across the world. The question though is, will he be able to sustain that? He's obviously has higher draft capital than a guy like Bagent for the Bears. So in the case of Bagent, maybe he caught people off surprise last week, helping them succeed with him. This week, not so much. That just happened. Will that happen with someone like Will Levis? But Will Levis has something that not many other quarterbacks have, and he has that arm talent and that athleticism that not many other quarterbacks have. He's the type that can roll one direction, flip it across his own body with minimal effort, and the ball just gets zipped. He just has that talent. It's just amazing he was able to make all those connections with DeAndre Hopkins. So we'll see. People may need a quarterback. You can go ahead and try to grab Will Levis. The other story here is Kirk Cousins, who tore his Achilles, and that's a heartbreaking loss. So I think maybe, I don't know if Jeremy already dropped him already, but they're gonna have to move on from him. And what they immediately made a move by trading for Josh Dobbs from Arizona. That Arizona situation is changing too. They're either gonna play their rookie, I think Clayton Tune from Houston, or they're scheduled to bring Kyler Murray back off the PUP. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. And then you had another nice score by Gabe Davis. As far as for Aaron, Fields is hurt, but maybe he'll come back at some point. He's always a threat to give you big points with his legs. Hollywood Brown had a decent game, 12.3. Demarcado had a okay game. Bourne had actually a pretty decent game. So that is the scores for the week. All right. So yeah, we are at that halfway point, and so we'll see what happens going forward. Let's see. league overview. Let me look at the standings. In the playoff picture right now, you have uh, Mike B at the top, followed by Jeremy, Darren, Morgan, James, and Eric. That's the playoff picture right now. And on the edge, you have Richie, myself, Gary, and and Aaron, all with 3-5 records. So again, there can be some movement. And at the bottom, we have Brad and Mike. So that's kind of like the standings at this point. But anyway, it's been an interesting season. It was a fun week to watch all like the upsets, a lot of upsets, a lot of surprise performances from players that we did not expect, and then just great performances overall, some disappointing performances by some, and then that becomes like the trigger for like change, and change is always interesting. So we're gonna see what happens to some teams who, they're gonna have to start going to tank mode. Some teams going into tank mode, that will have to change your strategy about maybe some players that you have on there on those types of rosters. Yeah, and then see what you can do in terms of finding players off the waiver wire. Anyway, that's all we got for today, so we'll see you later. Bye.